All right, Adam Weissler here. We're going inside music with the man himself,
Thomas Dolby.
But just as we're getting ready, I hear some of these classic tunes kind of through the hallways here. You listen to these every day. These are your creations. What's it like for you on a daily basis to still have these songs as part of your life?
It's good, actually. If you're going to be stuck with, with a couple of hits that won't seem to go away, then these are not bad ones to have. So I don't mind it. People sometimes find them sort of whistling Hyperactive as they walk behind me on the sidewalk and things like that, which is can be a little bit irritating, but it's not too bad.
Not too bad. No, the stuff still, I don't need to tell you how well this stuff holds up and how ahead of your time you were and how fabulous the music still sounds. And we're here in LA, and just going back to my personal experience, of course you hit big with MTV and you were with other music and you already had a career going, but here in LA it was K-Rock and it was Richard Blade and it was that time. What do you remember most about that time? Maybe your first time here in town, what that was like for you and how you were greeted?
It was really exciting because I think that MTV opened things up a little bit, diversity-wise. I think that rock had got very corporate already through the late 70s and early 80s, and I think the sort of the big hair, guitar, drum sound was sort of dominating American radio, and it was kind of hard for anything different to really get on. The punk new wave sounds were sort of a bit too radical and sort of scratchy for them. But when MTV started to really have an influence, if you had a great video, you could get on MTV sort of regardless of the music genre. And radio was starting to take notice of that because they needed to play the stuff that people were requesting because they'd fallen in love with the MTV videos. So that was great for people like me whose music sort of defied genres a little bit. And in the wake of that, I was getting played on rock radio, on urban radio, on alternative and so on. And that whole movement was really galvanized, the West Coast by K-Rock and those formats of stations. And there was a really strong sense of this movement going on, especially because it's largely British bands, but there was also Talking Heads and Blondie and people like that.
Sure.
These guys, who were sort of getting in the mix, B-52s and so on. So it really felt like it was a part of a movement. And I think the use of electronics as well was a significant aspect of that, because there was always a suspicion early on about synthesizers. They weren't real instruments. But people were starting to make great records with drum machines and synthesizers and samplers eventually, and I think it was sort of gradually taking hold.
Yeah, and you brought such a great sense of fun to it, and not every song, but there was a great sense of fun to your persona, and there was literally a sense of funk to it. You had fun with it, and I think that translated very well. How important was that to you, and how important is it still to you to have that sense of fun with an audience? It's not cold, it's not sterile, there's a liveliness to everything you do.
Yeah, I mean, some of my electronic music contemporaries sort of leaned into the sort of cold, dissociated aspect of machines. And machines do their thing very well, and you can make great art out of it, like Kraftwerk and Depeche Mode and people like that. But my goal was always to actually bring some warmth and humanity, via the electronics. And I think I was probably always a frustrated orchestral composer, really, because if you listen to my arrangements, often the way I use colors and textures, the way the parts are broken up is quite symphonic. Yeah,
and you have, even before Thomas Dolby as a pop star, you were doing that with some other great artists, and that's still out there, the stuff you worked on with Foreigner and other bands, those little subtle, some of it, but that really laid the groundwork for your later success. You know what you were doing early on.
Yeah, I think the industry sort of took notice of me because they'd heard the Foreigner stuff that I did. They'd heard the song that I wrote with Lena Lovitch, and keyboard contributions to different people. And so then when I came out with a solo career and a very, I think, identifiable, image and brand, it made an impact.
Let's talk about this tour right now, because this tour involves looking back a little bit. You've always been such a working forward, thinking forward guy. What's it like blending those two things for you? And how do you do that without being bored or distracted yourself? You're keeping it fun for yourself as well.
I love storytelling. I've increasingly, in intros to songs, I would often talk about, how and when they were created or who was in the studio when I made them. I'll sometimes unpack them and play individual chord sequences or beats or whatever, so the audience sort of feels, more involved. And then I wrote a memoir a few years ago, At the Speed of Sound, in which I sort of, came up with a lot of recollections of, the weird things that I've done along the journey, the whole journey, which is quite a journey, really. Not just music, but also high tech and ringtones and all sorts of crazy things. And so I think with this current tour that I'm doing, 80s Recollections, I'm sort of starting to set those stories to music. And this is an ongoing process, and I think the culmination of that will be at the end of this year or early next year. I'm going to start actually performing with a symphony orchestra, and using that as sort of the glue between my own music, between other acts that I've worked with or produced or played keyboards for or whatever, and really a sort of a symphonic backdrop, for this whole 80s story. And I think it's an apt time for it, partly because the 80s retro thing is obviously sort of peaking right now. There's a lot of interest in it, not just from people of our generation, but their kids, the younger people who are, I think, sort of fascinated by the rarefied air, of the 80s. There was still basically only a few dozen acts out there doing this stuff versus now, where there's thousands of new ones every day. So it feels a little bit special. But one of the things I noticed is that a lot of the 80s retro stuff is, leg warmers, go-go boots, it's like walking on sunshine, and girls just want to have fun and stuff like that, which is great. But if you were actually there, which we were, it was kind of a dark decade. You had Thatcher and Reagan, you had the Falklands, you had corporate greed, you had Cold War stuff going on, the Berlin Wall, etc. And of course, by today's standards, it all seems quite tepid. But when you were there, it was kind of dark. And I think that was reflected in some of the indie music coming out of the UK. The Smiths, the Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Echo and the Bunnymen, stuff like that. That I think reflected that vibe and that feeling of alienation that a lot of young people felt back then. And I'm sort of bringing that to the fore, really, with quotes from many of those artists, sort of sewn together into a patchwork of, this is my story of the 80s.
How many of those artists, how much of that community has still been a part of your life? How many of those people do you talk to? I know Billy Idol's here today doing something with you. I know what's that pathway like for you over the years?
It's actually great because people get nicer as they get older. Some, some not, but I mean, for the most part, we get friendlier. In the early days, the early 80s, there was a little bit of frenemy, going on, especially in the UK, where the music business was very claustrophobic. You had like Enemy, and the music papers sort of basically dictated tastes. And a handful of BBC producers got to decide what would be hits, what wouldn't. And I think between the bands there was always a little bit of hostility. And now if I bump into people, it's like, it's great. You have so much in common with. I mean, Billy, I may have rubbed shoulders with over the years, but I bet we have a lot of stuff in common. Maybe not the Harleys and the other stuff, but we probably have a lot of friends in common. So generally, at these kind of events, I have a great time, connecting with some of my contemporaries.
You were also very smart enough. You mentioned the ringtones and all these other things you've done, from the TED Talk times, all that stuff, to kind of take your career in so many other different directions. Talk about that in terms of, do you see that as different sides of the same Thomas Dolby, or those different lives you've led? How do you look back now at that trajectory?
I'm always fascinated with the new, and I hate the feeling of being sort of stifled because you're forced into a corner of, repeating yourself, making cookie cutter versions of the last thing that was successful. So I was always more attracted to something that was new and unexplored, maybe a new technology that hadn't really been defined yet. Nobody had figured out how to use it, for good. And that's always been the case. So whether it was, synthesizers, home studios, samplers, computer music, and then eventually interactive formats, and then the web and so on and on. There was always the next thing on the horizon that was sort of beckoning me. And I actually, if I plunge headfirst into something unknown, I like that stimulation, you know. I like the fact that it sparks my creativity. And I'm always a sort of glass half full type of guy, you know. So, I mean, for example, today with AI, everybody's like, oh my God, you know, it's going to take away jobs and cut down the rainforest and all the rest of it. But I only see the creative possibilities, which I think are huge. So I'm very excited by using new technologies like that and finding new ways to express myself with them.
And how are you doing that specifically? Because from the man himself, this is an exciting time for people that know how to use this kind of stuff. Yeah. You're probably already thinking where this could lead a decade from now and beyond. So how much of that, in a very tangible way, are you experimenting with, or are you looking forward to?
I love it, you know. One of the things about working with machines is that they have no knowledge or understanding of each other, right? I teach music at the Peabody Conservatory now. I stop by the orchestra rehearsals every day, and when they're really on, it's not just individuals making sound. They are resonating with their open strings, with their neighbors in the string section, with the open timpanis or the piano lid that's open, and when it all comes together, it's like watching a flock of birds or a school of fish. You know, you don't notice individual decisions; they're just moving as a sort of hive mind. But machines are monolithic, you know, like building blocks. You just you program a kick drum, you program a snare drum. They're not listening to each other. They're just doing what you say, maybe. But I think the way forward in the future is that all of these building blocks will actually be interconnected. You know, like when you see a fleet of drones sort of moving, and it's like there's this collective consciousness behind them. And I think that's the way forward for musical, you know, for electronic music, and that's very exciting.
It's interesting because you're doing this tour and you'll work with the symphony. Talk about the future, because you're always a man of the future and you have this technology and you're always forward thinking. How excited are you about Thomas Dolby over the next decade? How far ahead do you let yourself think and plan?
It's really hard to tell. You know, I'm in my late 60s now. I don't know how long I'll be doing this, but I think in a way the fact that I had, you know, 20, 25 years off in the middle when I wasn't touring, you know, when I wasn't making records very much, has given me a sort of second wind really at this point. And I'm really enjoying being out there. And heaven knows, I mean, I'm very grateful to be able to be getting paid to be out there doing this stuff. I never really got burnt out about it. You know, I never split up and got back together. You know, I am the one and only surviving member of the original Thomas Dolby. So it's nice to sort of feel that that's something quite authentic for people. I think, you know, this is somebody that was actually there, that actually did this stuff. You know, it's not a tribute, you know, band or anything like that. Yeah,
you're a family man. I think you've done things the right way over the years, where you can be satisfied with that career.
You know, I think balance is really everything, and there's very few people I would change places with. But I mean, I'm not very materialistic. So long as the repo man is not coming to take away my big screen TV, you know, then things must be good.
You figured that out, And just lastly, when you're doing something like today or playing one of your big shows and you're looking out at the crowd, just the sheer fun of seeing people dance along and smiling and enjoying Hyperactive, enjoying those Pirate Twins still.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic, and it's amazing really that you know, some stuff from that era seems to have this evergreen quality, and others are sort of lost in the sands of time, and it wasn't necessarily the most commercially successful or the highest charting, biggest selling records that got to stick around. But I think you know, because I get quoted a lot in everything from, you know, I'll be somebody's ringtone in Breaking Bad or The Big Bang Theory, you know, to these sort of quotes of my stuff all over the place. It's kept it going, so it's this sort of meme that pops up from time to time, and you know, long may that last.
What's the wildest place that you either licensed it and were aware, or were you surprised that it was used? I'm sure you've had both experiences.
And the weird thing is that, you know, you sign a piece of paper with the name of some show you've never heard of, which they're going to do a pilot of. And then if it goes to a series, you've forgotten all about it until one day somebody says, "Oh, I heard you on such and such." You go, "Really, that show?" And I'd forgotten now that I signed a piece of paper 2 years ago. You know, so it's that's pretty exciting. But you know, I think probably one of the pinnacles has to be you know, towards the climax of Breaking Bad, when somebody's phone goes off and that's the ringtone.
Yeah, that's so great. Yeah. And is there one song of yours that maybe hasn't reached that level but means so much to you, that is a personal favorite that you just hold dear, whether or not the audience is ever singing along?
you know, my hardcore fans are probably less into, you know, Science and Hyperactive and Europa than they are into Screen Kiss and Airwaves and I Love You Goodbye and Budapest by Blimp, Oceaneer is the most recent. And they tend to obsess over those, and those are the ones they want to hear at shows, which is sometimes not the easiest to do, to reproduce. But I mean, it you know, balance really. It's a case of like the tip of the iceberg might be there's 2 or 3 songs that people know, but then the real meat and potatoes is the deep cuts that mean so much to people. And
how nice to have an audience that sticks with you for all that, loves all that as well.
And the amazing thing about music is that, you know, when I found that chord change, when I found that melody, it sort of hit me here, and you just hope that somewhere out in the world it will connect with people that felt the same emotion when they heard that chord change. Lo and behold, when they come backstage and they tell me about, you know, why they love my music, it turns out it was that moment that got to them as well. So it's
how wonderful, to touch so many people, and have your music part of their lives. Well, congrats on the tour, congrats on everything. Very good.